Greetings and welcome back for another Music Theory Bite. In this video, I'm going to be showing you the basics of how to do a Roman numeral analysis. If that sounds like something you'd like to learn more about, then this is the video for you. But before you watch this video, you have to understand what Roman numerals are, and I have a video on that. It's about harmonic function in tonal music. Make sure you check that one out before you watch this video, otherwise this isn't going to make a whole lot of sense to you. So Roman numeral analysis is something that most beginning music students have to do. It's a basic skill that involves identifying chords and being able to identify the function of each chord. When I teach students to do Roman numeral analysis, I teach them to do it using 3 steps. First step is inventory, figure out what notes exist in the chord. The second step is arrangement, figure out how they go together to create a chordal structure. And the third step is interpretation. The first step, inventory, is usually pretty easy. That's simply counting notes. The second step, arrangement, is where things can get a little complicated. And the third step, interpretation, is usually pretty easy if you've done your work correctly on the arrangement step. So I'm going to run you through 2 quick pieces or parts of pieces that will show you how this will work. The first one's pretty obvious, and the second one offers a few more challenges that we're going to have to figure out how to put things together. So if you're ready, let's begin. What you see on your screen right now are the first 4 measures of the first prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1 by Johann Sebastian Bach. It presents a pretty straightforward example of how to do a Roman numeral analysis. Now, the first step when doing any sort of analysis is always listening to the music. That is essential because, well, music wasn't composed to be analyzed, it was composed to be listened to. And so sometimes composers will try to trick you. If you try to do it all by just looking at the notes, oftentimes you're going to make a mistake in there because you don't have a sense of what the music actually sounds like. An analysis is about explaining what the music sounds like. So, a good idea right now would be for you to stop this video, find a recording of this. There's plenty of good ones on YouTube or any of the streaming services. Listen to the very beginning of it, and then come back to this, and we'll start to talk about how to apply the steps of doing a Roman numeral analysis. Welcome back. Now that you've listened to the piece, we can start to apply our 3 steps: inventory, arrangement, and interpretation. So let's start with the first measure. When we listen to the piece, you should have heard that the chords basically change every measure. It's what we call the harmonic rhythm, or the rate of chord change. So that means that I can take all the notes from the first measure, and that will be the first chord, and all the notes from the second measure, and that will be the second chord, so on and so forth as we go through the piece. So inventory. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to take a look at what pitches exist in that first chord, in that first measure. And typically what I'll do is I'll advise a student to list them in alphabetical order. So I take a look. Do I have any A's? No. Do I have any B's? No. Do I have any C's? Yes, I have one in the bass and another one up in the right hand. D's? No. E's? Yes, I've got 2 of those. F's? No. G's? Yes. So I see out of all the collection of notes, I have C's, E's, and G's. My next step is to arrange these pitches so that they form a triad or a 7th chord. That is, arrange them so that I always have notes that are a third away or 2 letter names away from the next lower note. So in this case, I can take a look and I have C's, I skip the D's, and I have E's. I skip the F's and I have G's. It's already arranged so that I only have thirds. So in this case, I know that this is a chord built on C. The lowest note, when I have it all arranged in thirds, is going to be the root of the chord. So that's the arrangement step. Next, I have to interpret it. And I typically recommend that students interpret it in 2 ways. First, I'm going to figure out the root and quality of the chord, and I'm going to write that as a jazz chord symbol above the staff. So I have C, E, and G, and that forms a C major triad. If you need help interpreting that, check out my video on major and minor triads, triad qualities. All right, so C, E, and G, I have a C major triad. And then the next thing I'm going to do is figure out its function, its Roman numeral. So C is the first scale degree in the key of C, the key that we happen to be in this case. So since I know that it's the first scale degree, it's going to get Roman numeral 1. And since I know that it's a major triad, I'm going to write that 1 as a capital Roman numeral. Roman numeral capital 1, just like this. Let's move on to the second measure. So I start with my inventory. I have A's, I don't have any B's, I have C's, I have D's, no E's, I have F's, and no G's. Notice how when I'm doing this, I'm throwing out duplicate pitches. Basically, those don't mean anything. I'm just trying to figure out if I were to take what are the chord tones in here. Duplicate pitches don't add anything to the chord, they just reinforce things. So I'm throwing out all the duplicate pitches, and I see I have A's, C's, D's, and F's. So let's go on to the arrangement part of this. What I want to do is I want to see if I can arrange this in such a way so that I have only thirds. I don't have any notes that are right next to each other, and I don't have any notes where I have two letter names separating them. If I start on my A, if I take a look at my next note is a C, and then I have a D. Those two notes are next to each other, so that's not, A is not the root of the chord. If I start on C, I have a note next to that, which is a D, so that's not the root of the chord. If I start with my D, I then go up 2 notes to an F, and then I would have to go 2 more notes to get to an A, so I basically take the bottom of my scale and move it up to the top. And then I have 2 more notes to get to a C. I have all thirds. So in this case, D would be the root of the chord. Now there's a shortcut here that you can use, and that is whenever I have a second that is 2 notes next to each other, the root of the chord is usually the higher of those 2 pitches. So in this case, because my second has a C and a D, I can save myself some time by starting to count the chord up from that D, and if I find all thirds, then I know D is the root of the chord. So sure enough, D is the root of this chord, and it is a 7th chord because I have 4 chord tones in it. So, on to interpretation. D is the root of the chord. D is the second note in the key of C major, so it's going to be the supertonic, or a Roman numeral 2. I also need to figure out the quality, and I know that 2 chords typically are minor triads, and if they're 7th chords, they're going to be minor 7th chords. And I can double check that, and I have a video about how to do that. Check out my video on 7th chord qualities. And sure enough, this is a minor 7th chord. So I'm going to write above the staff D minor 7, that's my jazz chord symbol. I'm going to write my Roman numeral 2, 7 underneath, but wait a minute, it isn't in root position. The 7th of the chord, the C, happens to be the lowest note of the texture, and I want to show that in my Roman numeral, so I'm going to do that by using the figured bass symbol 4-2, which shows me that this is a 7th chord in 3rd inversion. So I have my first measure, I have a 1 chord going to a 2-4-2 chord. Let's move on to the third measure. So once again, I do my inventory. No A's, I have B's. No C's, I have D's. No E's, I have F's, and I have G's. So using my shortcut from before, this can save you some time. I take a look at where I have 2 notes in a row, F and G, and I take the higher of those 2 pitches, and that is most likely the root of this chord. So if I start spelling it out from G, I have G, skip A, I have a B, that's a third. Skip the C, I have a D, that's another third. Skip the E, and I have an F, that's another third. So this is a 7th chord because I have 4 notes all separated by thirds, and G is the root of the chord. Next, I'm going to check and see what quality this chord is. G, B, D is a major triad. Then G to F is a minor 7th. That means this is a dominant 7th chord. It's a G7 chord, so I'll write that above the staff as my jazz chord symbol. And then for my Roman numeral, G, the root of the chord, is the 5th scale degree in the key of C. I can count up C, D, E, F, G. Counting on my fingers, I end up with 5. So it's going to be a Roman numeral 5, capital, because the G triad is a major triad. And then since it's a 7th chord and I want to show its inversion, I'm going to use the correct inversional symbol for that. The root of the chord is not in the bass. The third of the chord is, which is that B. So I'm going to write the figured bass symbol for a first inversion 7th chord, which is 6-5. I have a 5-6-5. Sure enough, if I take a look at what I have right now, the first measure is a 1 chord, a tonic chord. Second measure is a 2 chord, a 2-4-2, a predominant chord, which is pretty normal for harmonic progression. The third measure is a dominant 7th chord in first inversion, a 5-6-5. I'm expecting whenever I have a dominant 7th chord that my next chord is going to be some sort of tonic chord or possibly a submediate chord. So I can actually do this a little bit more quickly if I anticipate what the next chord is going to be. If I have a 5 chord in measure 3, most likely I'm going to have a 1 chord in measure 4, which would be the notes C, E, and G. If I take a look at this, sure enough, those are the notes that I have. And not only that, this measure is identical to the first measure. So rather than having to figure out everything again, if I can find repetitions, that will save me some work. You've probably noticed, if you've done any Roman numeral analysis in your music theory classes, that there are some people that seem to do this very quickly and other people that it seems to take forever to do. Hopefully you're in that first category and not the second. If you are in the slower category, chances are you're just not thinking about it as efficiently as you could. That is, you're not recognizing when there's repetition. And notice how I said that when I arrived on my 5 chord in measure 3, I already knew what to expect in the fourth measure. A 5 chord resolves to a 1 chord. The people who are really fast at doing Roman numeral analysis tend to have that sense of what should come next, and so they're not checking things out to spell everything. And oftentimes what they're doing is they are just verifying what they expect will already be there. And sure enough, if I have a normal tonic, predominant, dominant, tonic progression, I would expect that after my dominant chord, my third measure, I would have a tonic chord in the fourth measure. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens here. Let's move on to a different piece, one that might present us with a few more challenges. This is also by Bach. It's the second minuet from his French suite in D minor. It's a lovely piece, so you should listen to it first. We're only going to go up through the first 16 measures, up to the repeat sign, what you see on your screen right now. So go listen to the beginning of the second minuet of Bach's French suite in D minor. Then come back to this, and we'll start to apply our methods for doing our Roman numeral analysis. So back to my steps. First step is inventory. Let's see what notes we have here. I have A's, I have a C, I have a D, and I have an F, and I have a G. Well, that certainly makes things more complicated because I have more than 1 second in here. That is, it's a lot harder to figure out where the seconds are. It's not just the notes that go into a triad or a 7th chord. So the first thing I would want to do is listen to it and see if the chord has a particular sound to it, and that could help me. But if you happen to be in a test where you're not allowed to listen to it, you might have to hear it in your head. Or we can also figure things out just by using a little bit of logic. So I take a look at the first beat of this, the strong beat of this, and I see I have A's, D's, and F's. I'm going to start with that as my inventory. Now, just as on the previous piece, when I had a 7th chord, I was looking for that second, and the top note of that would tell me what the root of the chord was in many cases. When I have a triad, and I have a note where I have a space of a 4th in the chord, oftentimes the top note of that 4th is going to be the root of the chord. So, if I go A, D, F, I notice that between the A and the D, I have a 4th. So if I were to start to spell this thing up from the D, that might be my triad. D, up to F, up to A. And sure enough, those are all thirds. So what I have here is a D chord, and I'm going to check the quality, and that's going to be D minor. So I'm going to write that up top. And then I notice that this piece is in the key of D minor, and sure enough, D is the tonic chord in the key of D minor, and since it's a minor triad, I'm going to write lowercase Roman numeral 1. Now let's deal with some of these other chord tones, or these other tones that show up in the measure. I have this G, which doesn't really seem to fit, no matter what I do with it. In this case, what we're dealing with is a note that shows up very briefly and very quickly, so what we're probably dealing with here is a non-chord tone. A non-chord tone is an embellishing tone that shows up in the musical texture, but it isn't supported by the harmony underneath. So in this case, I would identify it as a non-chord tone. In this particular case, because it's approached by step and left by step in the opposite direction, I would call this a neighboring tone. And you can check out my video on non-chord tones to get all the definitions of the non-chord tones that you might need in order to do this sort of analysis. And when I spot that I have a non-chord tone, I'm just going to ignore it for the purposes of my Roman numeral analysis. Now the C presents me with an interesting situation. I could simply stick that on top of the chord and make it a seventh chord. So in this case, it would be a 1/7 chord. That low D seems to sound throughout the whole measure. In which case, it becomes a seventh chord on the third beat of the measure. So what I would do is I'd write my Roman numeral 1 at the beginning, and then I'd put the inversional symbol underneath the C when it turns into a seventh chord, and that would give me the complete picture of the whole measure. Or I could also take a look at this and treat it as a non-chord tone. It's not a part of the chord, it's on a weak beat, and it connects the D that precedes it to the B flat that follows it. So in this case, I have a choice of how I want to do it, and it really depends on how I want to hear it. This is where you have to start making some of those interpretive decisions. Does it sound like a seventh chord to you, or does it sound like a triad with a passing tone? There's really not a wrong answer here. It's just how you choose to interpret that C. My ear says the triad becomes a seventh chord on the third beat, and then we move on to the next chord in the next measure. Let's move on to the second measure. I'll start with my inventory. I have A's. I have B flats. Make sure you don't forget to apply the accidentals that show up in the key signature. I have C's. I have D's. I don't see any E's. I have F's and I have G's. So I have almost all the pitches that show up in the scale occurring in this measure. And that presents the big challenge. How do I interpret this? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is take a look at the strongest beat of the measure, and that would be beat 1, the downbeat, and see what I have there. I see I have G's and B flats if I'm stacking those in thirds. That doesn't give me a whole triad, but then if I look a little bit further into the measure, I'll notice that I have a D on another fairly strong metric position in the measure. I have a D on the downbeat of beat 2. So that tends to suggest that I'm dealing with G, B flat, and D, and some of these other pitches are non-chord tones. So that would mean that my C is a non-chord tone, and my A is a non-chord tone. Those would both be passing tones. If I take a look at the third beat of the measure, then things start to move around a little bit there, and maybe I have another chord there. So I'll deal with that after I deal with the first two beats of the measure. So I have G's, B flats, and D's as my chord tones. And that would be a G minor triad, which I'll write above the staff as a jazz chord symbol. And G is the fourth scale degree in the key of D minor, so that would be a Roman numeral 4. And since it starts on the downbeat on the B flat in the bass, that would be a 4 chord in first inversion. So I'd write that as a 4/6, and then I would show that it goes to root position at the end of beat 2 by writing the figured bass symbol for a root position triad 5/3. And that makes a lot of sense, going from a 1 chord, a tonic chord in measure 1, to a predominant chord, in this case a 4 chord at the beginning of measure 2. Now if I go on and try to deal with the third beat of measure 2, I can see, if I do my inventory again, I have F's, A's, C's. If I'm stacking these up in thirds, I'm kind of shortening my inventory step here and not writing it out A to G and then figuring out where my chord tones are. I could take that and turn that into an F major chord, but I think really what I want to do here is listen to it, and that will tell me whether I'm really hearing a separate chord on the third beat or whether those are just non-chord tones. And when I listen to this, I tend to hear those as non-chord tones, so I'm going to treat that whole measure as a 4 chord. Let's move on to the third measure and see what we end up with there. So once again, doing my inventory, I have A's, B's, C's. I don't see B flats, sorry. I have A's, B flats, C's, no D's, I have E's, I don't see any F's, and I have G's. So again, most of the notes in the scale are represented here, so what I'm going to want to do is take a look at my strongest beat where I have C's, E's, and G's. Well, that sure forms a triad, and if I take a look at the second strongest beat, beat 2, I also have C's, E's, and G's there. So in this case, I think I'm dealing with a C major triad. Write that above the staff, and then C is Roman numeral 7, and it's a major triad, so I'm going to write it as a major Roman numeral 7 beneath the staff. And if I were to continue the step all the way through to the end of this, what I'll find is that I have one of my standard sequential progressions, a 1 chord, going to a 4 chord, going to a 7 chord, my fourth measure, so I'm already thinking about how to make this quicker. If I have 1, 4, 7, my next chord should be a 3 chord, this is just a circle of fifths progression, followed by a 6 chord in measure 5, followed by a 2 chord in measure 6, and there things start to get a little bit funny on me as I begin to approach the end of the progression, but you'll notice how I have shortened the amount of work I have to do. I've made it a lot quicker by, once I recognize what's going on, I'm now just verifying what goes on from that point on. So once again, just to summarize, when doing a Roman numeral analysis, step 1, make sure you listen to the piece of music. Make sure you've heard it, because that ultimately is going to guide whenever you have to make a decision regarding how to label something, when to label something, when not to label something. And if you're still not quite sure when to do it, that will get better as you do more of this. After you've listened to it, then make sure that you are following these steps. Do the inventory of pitches, do the arrangement of the pitches, and that's usually the most difficult part, and then finally do the interpretation of the pitches. That's where you write the jazz chord symbol up top and the Roman numeral analysis at the bottom, complete with figured bass symbol. And if you follow those steps and then double check what you have by listening to the piece again after you have done your Roman numeral analysis, then you should come up with something pretty close. Once again, if you're not real confident with it, just keep doing it. Keep practicing this skill, because the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. Well, that does it for this video. If you found it helpful, please make sure you like it. Feel free to leave constructive comments below, and as always, make sure you subscribe to my channel for the latest music theory bites as they become available. Until next time.